Okay, well, thank you. Well, welcome everyone to our panel on the geopolitics of sanctions and public health. The first one in what we hope will be a series of panels on the topic of the geopolitics of sanctions. And I'm Claudia Chopin. I'm a physician from Argentina. I'm retired from medical practice, and I'm currently a faculty member in health policy at York University. And I know many of you, but not everyone on this call today. I'm also a member, and recent member, of the International Manifesto Group that sponsors this event. And I'll just read this little blurb because Radhika, you've done this before, and we assume that there's always somebody who's new. Certainly the panelists are the group. So the IMG is a group of academics, intellectuals, and activists that at the onset of COVID-19 pandemic began to meet to discuss the evolving geopolitical economy of the current world order and its implications of this, the implications of this world order for the hope of a better world, a more just world. So, and we have members from around the world, and we probably around the world people in this call today, and we meet every 2 weeks, and many of our meetings are public, like panels and presentations like this one. So as stated in our invitation, economic sanctions are becoming an increasingly popular, if you will, between quotations, foreign policy instrument in Western countries. Sanctions are deployed alone or along military and or diplomatic interventions to achieve, according to sanctioning countries, important strategic, political, and policy goals. For instance, protecting human rights from individuals allegedly oppressed by their own governments, protecting democratic institutions allegedly under threat by authoritarian regimes, as they're called, or protecting allegedly legitimate national security concerns. Now, because sanctions are considered a less violent than direct military assault, they're often supported by many on the left and in the peace movement, who reluctantly accept the policy as a necessary evil. A compelling example was support for sanctions by sectors of the left during the First Gulf War. The first panel will focus on the public health effects of sanctions in their geopolitical context. We have 5 excellent speakers, and I'm really, really grateful for all of you to have accepted, representing a pile of sanctioned countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, and Iran. I believe that Mohammed has an activities with students at the moment, and he's maybe arriving a little late. So if he's not here already, Mohammed Morandi, Professor Morandi. So Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, and Iran, all but one under sanctions by both Canada and the United States. Now, Cuba bears the notable privilege of, or honor, of being under sanctions by the USA only, sanctions that all but a handful of countries have opposed over the last, many, many years, right? The 5 speakers in order of appearance include Sarah Kendall, we'll talk about Cuba, Sida Pascual Marquino will talk about Venezuela, John Perry about Nicaragua, Mohammed Morandi on Iran, and Vanessa Bili on Syria. And all but one are in the countries, they live in the countries that are being right now under sanctions. So speakers will present for about 12 minutes each, which should take up to about an hour and leave plenty of time for a productive Q&A session, during which the speakers will elaborate on whatever issues members of the audience bring up. So for now, please mute your microphones until the speakers are done with their presentations. And that said, feel free to make comments in the chat. During the Q&A, we will invite you to ask questions, preferably speaking up, because we're not that many after all. But I'll do my best to follow the chat as well. So without further ado, let us move to the first speaker, Sarah Kendall. And now I'm going to tell you folks who Sarah is. And then as speakers come in, I'll give you a brief description of the background of each speaker. So Sarah is a medical doctor trained in Havana, Cuba. She's a community organizer and arts and social justice education facilitator and a professional paramedic from Vancouver, Canada. Over the past 2 decades, Sarah has been committed to international solidarity work, collaborating with and supporting Latin American community struggles, particularly in the resistance to neoliberal free trade agreements, so-called free trade, uh, support for migrant people, and the defense of land and life against Canadian mining corporations. This work, along with a profound respect for the Cuban medical project and her own dedication to integrated and universal healthcare, led Sarah to full-time study and work within the public health system in Havana, Cuba from 2014 to 2020. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Sarah. Sarah, please take it away.
Hello, good morning. I'm Sarah from Vancouver here in the south of the city. In the south of the city is Musqueam territory, unceded, as in never ceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples beyond the Musqueam, also the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh are the original land stewards and true title holders of where I'm speaking from at 6 a.m. So greetings to everyone who's somewhere further away. I come with a lot of humility to this conversation because I won't be speaking on the details of the sanctions that have been imposed in what we call the blockade against Cuba, not just a nicing up of the term as an embargo, but just declaring it as a total blockade against the country. I don't speak from the position of those most affected by the blockade, because those are Cuban people, and with my multi-layers of privilege, I had an inevitable level of protection when I was there, and I'm now back in Canada after 6 years of living in Havana. So my respect for those who are living the experience right now, because it's a worsening experience in these days. I think that folks are probably quite familiar with the basic story of Cuba and how intrinsic to the revolutionary process in Cuba healthcare has been. And that was my reason for becoming so kind of fixated on Cuban medicine as a way to bring back home to Turtle Island or North America knowledge and skills that would be relevant to the needs of communities who are most struggling here where I'm from, in Turtle Island, aka North America. And that's why I went to Cuba, because of how they were able to continue to realize Canadian scale or European Union level of health statistics for their population, despite being both literally and figuratively an isolated and attacked country. So Cuba, since 1959 and 60, once the revolution was established in the country, has maintained the same commitment to free, universally accessible, solidarity-oriented healthcare, and with an incredible degree of continued knowledge production that has been since the blockade was first established in 1962, under constant oppression by the United States government. As Claudia mentioned, it is the United States that has their blockade officialized against Cuba, but it is very much an international predicament because of the way that the US punishes any third parties, even those who have no economic connection or direct relationship with the US during their time of trade and relationship with Cuba. That degree of economic limitation against other countries is really quite profound. Just within the last year, the question of transportation of what can arrive at the island has become absolutely massive for healthcare. So the ships themselves of other countries are being sanctioned from arriving at Cuba, and that has always been the case with elements of the blockade, such as the prohibition of any ship arriving in US territory if they had previously touched the port of any place in Cuba within 6 months prior. So elements like that have always been incredibly limiting, but through the Trump administration and not yet rescinded by the new US administration, are kind of stepping up of all of the elements of travel to the island, both in terms of personal travel, the travel of ships from other countries being directly sanctioned, and those organizing perhaps like, so 3 individuals, 54 actual vessels, and 27 companies just in the past year alone, the past fiscal year, were directly punished for having any relationship with Cuba, at the same time that folks were having more limited legal access from the United States to come, as well as more limited legal access for planes to arrive where in the country. And then once being in Havana, a larger list of places that were illegal for US citizens to actually go. So all of this, the details we could talk about later, but the compounding of the multi-layers of life that are affected actually affects the medical system in all ways too, because the very individuals who are the actors of the medical system are living under an incredible stress. And I guess that the title of the panel being the effect of sanctions on healthcare is that healthcare in Cuba has always continued to be provided, and provided with a level of excellence and a level of internationalism beyond any other country that I know of, where folks are continued to be served locally, and also have doctors, nurses, medical technicians continue to serve outside of Cuba, and students internationally continue to come to Cuba for their medical training, but it's happening under great duress. So it's not that the health of the Cuban people has necessarily been compromised because it is such a priority for the country. It continues to be prioritized. Folks are under the consequences, therefore, of the stress that has to happen with. So, just little, it's hard to know whether to speak more macro or more micro from my direct experience, but in, snapshots of that mean that perhaps we can get all the medical students to be training to have many, many doctors per capita for the country, like the country upholds, but those students might be, like I was in my first year 7 years ago of medical school, sent home from final exams because we don't actually have paper to print the exams on. So the healthcare system is in place, the people are being trained, but the very basics are not there to do some of the work. And therefore there's an incredible physical and psychological stress on the system. If we fast forward to now, some of the elements that I briefly mentioned have been imposed more recently. Those I mentioned, plus remissions have been, like remittances of money to the country have been limited by the Trump administration, and it remains that way. Western Union was pulled out of the country. And so it only is escalating, and then COVID arrived as well. So the degree of need for for kind of deep intervention by the medical system into the infrastructure of daily life was really stepped up over the past year and a half. I guess we're almost at 2 years now, year and a half. And yet the material resources have only been getting worse. So yesterday's update from a friend that I was chatting with is that it's down to not having syringes for the vaccine that Cuba has developed. So Cuba has 5 vaccines actually that have been developed, 3 working in concert together, approved already by the World Health Organization and being rolled out. And folks are eager to be getting vaccinated, but there aren't syringes. And a friend of mine is, she's in her late 70s and she's running around the city trying to find medical tape to send it to another city because a friend of hers who is a doctor herself has a small surgery that needed to take place and doesn't have medical tape to cover the wound. And the Cuba continues to do its work, as in its own medical production of, for example, antibiotics, continue in production, but it's just physically impossible to produce the kinds of antibiotics across the entire spectrum. So medicines were dwindling when I was last there and about 7 months ago, and it's really, truly only gotten worse since. In that way, I don't know how much more to speak to, because I could speak to details of what it was like to work on obstetrics and gynecological hospital wards where we need to be sterilizing and reusing very thin plastic gloves, or keep giving these examples of surgical wards where we have no iodine. And yet the main message is that the healthcare project in Cuba continues. It continues as it was established to be, with the priorities being free, universal, accessible, solidarity-oriented healthcare across the entire country. And what is really limiting the provision of that healthcare and does result in health crises for folks. Sometimes it really does matter at the end of the day. If you don't have what you need to serve a patient, there are consequences to that. But by and large, the message is the same, that Cuba remains committed to its education of its healthcare workers and the provision of healthcare services where necessary, but under greater and greater duress. And the psychological effects of that stress really do matter to be able to continue over the next years. So there are a lot of economic changes afoot that the country is trying to establish. They've recently removed, it was a two-currency system for quite a while now, and it's now gone back to just the nationalized peso. And there are attempts to stimulate foreign investment while maintaining the socialist character of the country. And that, of course, works in concert with the socialist character of the healthcare system. There are a lot of folks who are still there for medicine. I was amazed to hear from the international relations director of the University of Medical Sciences of Havana recently, who runs 17 faculties inside Havana. And those are a number of universities, and there are many more across the country, that despite the beginning months of COVID really affecting the ability of folks to be in the country if they were foreigners, they have about 6,000 foreign students at that university still taking classes, managing to go through their educational process. Usually they would have about 8,000 or 9,000, so that's been a big economic hit. Cuba trains, at this point, the population majority would be African students who come as a country-to-country agreement to train folks from underserved areas of many African countries. And those home countries pay Cuba, which is one piece of economic stabilization for the healthcare system. Anyway, I know that was small amounts of information, many just anecdotal, but I hope in the Q&A to be able to provide some more information in the ways that are relevant for people.
So very excited to have John Perry with us today. John lives and works in Masaya, Nicaragua, which I had a chance to visit in 2019. And he's been based in Masaya, or Masaya, as they say, since 2003. And he's originally from the UK, works with local NGOs that promote sustainable farming methods in the Masaya region, and helping to build solar lighting schemes for families in isolated rural areas. And Masaya was a big center in the coup, in the thankfully failed coup in April 2018. So he's also an independent journalist and reports on Nicaragua. He has published in The Nation, the London Review of Books, Counterpunch, Council of Hemispheric Affairs, Raised on Nika Notes, among many outlets. And I strongly recommend that you follow his work if you want to be up to date in what's going on in Nicaragua. Thank you, John. Go ahead.
Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Good morning, everybody from Nicaragua. I'm delighted to take part in this seminar, which is very interesting. I'm already very interested to hear what is going on in Cuba, and horrified by the shortage of syringes. Let me give you some basic facts about Nicaragua. It's one of the poorest countries in Latin America, but it's been tackling poverty very strongly over the last 15 years, when poverty has fallen by half. Healthcare is free, And indeed, the Sandinista government has been investing very strongly in the health system and has built 19 new hospitals since 2007, and 6 more are under construction. And in fact, at the time of when the pandemic started, the country had more hospital beds per 1,000 people than some more advanced countries like Colombia and Mexico in the same region. The US sanctions are less important for Nicaragua than for the other countries we're hearing about today. But the influence of the US is still extremely important, not least because of the US provoked violence in 2018. I won't go into the details of this because we want to talk about other issues, but much of the country was destroyed. There was a particular focus on public buildings and public services. So health centres, health supplies were ransacked, and doctors were threatened. Doctors have been sanctioned since. And so the Nicaraguan recovery process really for the last 3 years from the violence that occurred in that year. It's had to cope with other things too. So we've had the economic effects of the coup, followed by, of course, the COVID pandemic. But we've also had a drastic fall off in tourism starting in 2018. And of course, that's not recovered because of the pandemic. And then in November last year, Nicaragua and Honduras were hit by 2 very severe hurricanes, Eta and Iota, which had a very destructive effect on the Atlantic coast. So as well as the sanctions, we're having to put up with all of these pressures, which are putting severe limits on Nicaragua's economy. Nicaragua had a very active strategy for dealing with the pandemic when it began, or before it began. A COVID-19 commission was set up in January. That's before many countries began to get to grips with the possible pandemic, and even before the pandemic was declared. A plan was published about facing the crisis in February that year. This involved tighter border controls with health checks and quarantines. And one hospital was equipped solely for dealing with COVID cases in Managua, and 18 others were equipped with ICUs that could deal with COVID. All of the health workers, 36,000 people, including porters and everyone else, were trained in dealing with COVID. And health brigades began to visit house to house, and I've often visited houses 3 or 4 times during the course of the pandemic. And there were other measures, but no lockdown. This is an important difference between Nicaragua and many other countries. There was no formal lockdown of the economy at any stage. The country's plan became the subject of criticism by the opposition, and for this reason, the government produced a white paper on its plan in May 2020 in order to show people what it was doing. But this didn't prevent the opposition, financed by the US, from having a drastic campaign to attack the Sandinista government and accuse it of indifference to the pandemic. As part of this campaign, there were ridiculous claims about the large numbers of COVID deaths that would occur, and a citizens observatory, so-called citizens observatory, was set up, which started to issue statistics, false statistics about the pandemic that were often based on rumors or information gathered from Facebook. And this conflicted with the government statistics. For example, at the moment, this Citizens Observatory says that Nicaragua's had 17,300 COVID cases, whereas the official figure is 7,400. And they've particularly exaggerated the numbers of deaths. But it was these figures that were used and are still being used by the New York Times, the Guardian in the UK, by the BBC, CNN, and so on. The BBC and all the other media started saying that Nicaragua was ignoring the pandemic. And then in April, the Guardian, Washington Post, BBC and New York Times all had stories about the absence of Daniel Ortega, as if he fled the country or himself was suffering from COVID, which wasn't the case. So we had even a large spread in the Washington Post saying that Daniel Ortega was absent, had vanished, and criticising the government's laissez-faire approach to the pandemic. Again, totally false, but all provoked by media that were being paid by the US government, Nicaraguan media that were being paid by the US government. And even in April, when the government had started its vaccination campaign very successfully and very well organized, The Guardian, for example, asked to look at the success of Nicaragua's tackling of the pandemic, came out with this headline: Nicaraguan ruler Ortega rolls out vaccination campaign amid secrecy and doubt. Note that Daniel Ortega is a ruler of Nicaragua, and Nicaragua is often referred to as a regime, as indeed are the governments of the other countries we're talking about today. There was no secrecy, of course, about the vaccination campaign. Let me show you some of the figures about what actually happened in Nicaragua compared with other countries. This was a graph that I produced earlier showing death levels from COVID in Nicaragua compared with other countries in the region. And you can see that even on the figures produced by the Unofficial Citizens Observatory, Nicaragua was doing well. But more importantly, in many ways, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Washington has this month produced very good figures, and figures that they calculated themselves for deaths from COVID per 100,000 inhabitants across Latin America, indeed across the world, but we're looking at Latin America at the moment. And these show how well Venezuela, Cuba, and particularly Nicaragua have done during the pandemic, that they really minimized the numbers of deaths occurring from the pandemic, obviously due to the socialized health system that all three countries have got in place despite the sanctions. And the same Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has produced some charts showing, for example, the stress on the health systems in each country. And Nicaragua was shown to be the least stressed health system in the whole of Latin America, as you can see from the chart. The green line shows normal hospital systems, and the red line shows congestion and very heavy use of hospital systems. And Nicaragua only had a short period of a couple of months in 2020 when its hospital systems were severely severely occupied. In contrast, Honduras, which of course is an ally of the US, has had a terrible experience in dealing with COVID. There have been widespread protests against the strict lockdowns that have been imposed. The health service can't cope, and still, even at this stage, is severely stressed. There have been over 240,000 COVID cases. There have been plenty of international aid, but much of it has disappeared in corruption. And one of the most famous instances has been 7 mobile hospitals bought from Turkey, of which only 2 are working, and even those 2 aren't working properly. And the people who arranged the contract, which I think was worth $47 million, several of them have been arrested. And the persecution of doctors who protest and journalists who expose the problems in the system continues. We can contrast the treatment by the US of the 2 countries. Honduras has received $8 million in US aid, it's received equipment, and it's going to benefit from the vaccines that are going to be sent out from the US to the whole of Latin America soon. Nicaragua has had only a tiny amount of assistance, and that hasn't gone to the government, that's gone to non-government organizations which the US favors. It hasn't received any equipment or vaccines from the US, and isn't going to get them either. And of course, it's been subject to economic sanctions. Even so, the level of vaccination in Nicaragua is higher than either Honduras or Guatemala. This chart shows US assistance, and you can see how little Nicaragua's received, $0.75 million compared with, say, $28 million to El Salvador. And there's a similar picture with test kits, field hospitals, ventilators, and so on. I want to summarize the effects of the sanctions. US is blocking international loans. For example, World Bank funding stopped, is now resumed. Instead, Nicaragua is relying on the Inter-American Development Bank, where it's supported by Taiwan and other countries. It's become more dependent on bilateral aid, so it's getting help from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Cuba, Russia, and other places. The help that did come from the US didn't go to the Sandinista government, but was used effectively for anti-Sandinista purposes. The US has sent no vaccines, as I mentioned. There have been personal sanctions against key figures in the Sandinista government. So Sonia Castro, who was health minister, is being personally sanctioned by the US because supposedly she closed the hospitals to opposition protesters in 2018, which was incorrect. And so she had to stop being health minister and is only an advisor to the health ministry now. And sanctions are delaying economic recovery after COVID and after the problems of 2018. I think another factor is that US support for the sanctions and for anti-Sandinista media means that Nicaragua is getting no credit for its performance in dealing with the pandemic, which I've tried to describe in this presentation. Vaccinations have now begun. So far, Nicaragua has received about 400,000 vaccine doses, Covishield and the Russian Sputnik vaccines mainly. So far, all older people and all health workers have been offered vaccines. The picture shows somebody called Vilma Nunez, who's an opposition spokesperson or opposition member. And many of the opposition members, prominent people, were vaccinated as part of the campaign. And finally, I just wanted to show a slide which is a picture from the hospital in Masaya. It was one of the 19 equipped nationally to deal with COVID cases. At the peak in early June, it had 90 patients in the ICU with COVID, but the numbers fell off substantially and had fallen to 6 by the end of July last year. And the photo shows an event which took place in August to thank the staff, not only the doctors and nurses, but the porters and the cleaners for their efforts. That was attended by many of the patients who benefit from the hospital services. So I hope that gives you a bit of a picture of how Nicaragua has been dealing with the pandemic. Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, very much for that, very compelling update. And I just have to say that to add to it, the Canadian government is in overdrive to boycott, undermine the upcoming elections. And it has yesterday released a communication expressing concern that the regime is crushing the opposition. And I sent it to John so that he knows that we are not very behind the United States. In fact, we're tagging along very nicely and very effectively. Let's move on to Vanessa. And we could hear Vanessa well this morning, so I hope everything will go well. So let me introduce Vanessa Dili, whom I've been following for a couple of years now. She's very active and publishes, and now is located in Syria. So let me say a few words about her. She's a journalist and a photographer, a quite compelling photographer too, who has worked extensively in the Middle East, on the ground in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Palestine, while also covering Yemen since 2015. She's currently based in Damascus, Syria, and holds several awards in journalism. In 2017, as finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, in 2018 as one of the most respected journalists in the UK by the British National Council for the Training of Journalists, and in 2019 as recipient of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromising integrity in journalism. Vanessa contributes regularly to Mint Press News, RT, The Last American Vagabond, and other multiple independent media outlets, and you can sign on her blog and follow her. So welcome, Vanessa, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me. I think my overview is going to be much more of a generalized view, but with a final focus on the health sector, which of course is being pummeled not only by war, but by sanctions that are working in conjunction with the war itself. Sanctions are very often described by those enforcing them as non-lethal measures, as you mentioned, Claudia. I would argue that sanctions, when used as a brutal and vindictive component of a neo-colonialist hybrid war strategy, are arguably more devastating than a military war. When they are imposed by global superforce nations against weaker and poorer target nations like Syria, in conjunction with a proxy war that has been fomented and sustained by the same nations, it becomes as much a weapon of mass destruction as the terrorist mercenary armies these US-aligned nations have unleashed upon the Syrian people. Thus, for me, it's almost impossible to speak about the economic sanctions against Syria in isolation and without referring to the parallel measures that ensure they hit the poorest people in Syria the hardest. I would argue that the effects of the US, UK, EU, Turkish and Arab League sanctions are equivalent to the campaign of infrastructure destruction carried out by the illegal armed groups funded and armed by the US regime change coalition, in other words, the same nations, and promoted by their aligned media outlets. The act of withholding means of sustaining life to innocent civilians in order to coerce an entire nation into submission to foreign agendas in the region must surely qualify as economic terrorism. The destruction of essential civilian infrastructure is a war crime. The withholding of essential resources or occupation of those resources is also a war crime. The correlation between economic and military coercion was made clear by previous Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's point man on Syria, Ambassador James Jeffrey, who not only described Al-Qaeda as a US asset in Syria, but also bragged openly about the misery that sanctions had brought to the Syrian people. In December 2020, I believe, he said, "Of course, we've ratcheted up the isolation and sanctions pressure on Assad. We've held the line on no reconstruction assistance, and the country is desperate for it. You see what's happened to the Syrian pound. You see what's happened to the entire economy." So it's been a very effective strategy. In other words, he's crowing about the success of imposing universal misery against the Syrian people. There are a number of sectors of Syrian society that are being targeted by sanctions, and those all impact upon the health sector. But they are also being targeted by US occupation and proxy terrorism, which ensure that quality of life for Syrian civilians is severely reduced and their human rights are being gravely violated. First of all, the fuel or oil sector. Production had been affected drastically by the sanctions applied in 2011, 2012, and even before. The effect of curtailing import and export of petrol between 2011 and 2014 is estimated to be around a $21 billion loss for Syria. When ISIS occupied the Syrian oil-rich region of northeast Syria, they were banking around $3 million per day in stolen revenue. The Kurdish separatist US Contras are now benefiting also from the sale of Syrian resources on the back of the US occupation of the northeast oil fields. The US itself is stealing Syrian oil via Delta Crescent Energy oil company established under the Trump administration. Other beneficiaries include Al-Qaeda, who also set up an oil refinery monopoly going by the name of Watad that receives the stolen oil stolen by the US and its proxies and then trades it in Turkey. Effectively, the US or their proxies seized Syrian oil fields early on in the conflict, and this provided revenue for the various Contra forces under their control, including ISIS, enabling them to further steal resources, ethnically cleanse areas of Syria, and destroy infrastructure, while increasing sanctions and imposing a brutal blockade on the Syrian people, the majority of whom live in areas now under the protection of the Syrian government. The industrial sector, and this of course includes the pharmaceutical industry. A huge number of factories have been forced out of existence by incremental sanctions, and production has been reduced in those that survive. The cause is lack of fuel, electricity, parts for machinery. The majority of the machines and the parts came from the EU. They are now banned. A report from the Aleppo Chamber of Commerce in 2015 detailed total closure of 26,000 factories, partial closure of 17,000, and suspended production in 50,000. At the same time, armed groups, including Nusra Front and ISIS, invaded the industrial areas of Aleppo and dismantled thousands of factories, destroyed power grids, railways, etc. And to provide trade revenue in Turkey, many factories were re-established inside Turkey. In October 2015, the US coalition bombed the Aleppo thermal power station, then under control of ISIS, ensuring total blackout in Aleppo and the surrounding countryside. The agricultural sector. This sector has been affected by, of course, the rising costs of fuel, the lack of machinery parts thanks to the sanctions. Some of the most abundant olive and cotton growing areas have been occupied by the armed groups, who again benefit from the illegal trade of Syrian food crops via Turkey and Iraq. Vast swathes of Syrian forestry and wheat crops were deliberately burned in 2020. The US coalition dropped thermal balloons into wheat crops in the northeast. Kurdish Contras took control of wheat storage facilities and restricted supply to Damascus to the Syrian people. Bread queues became a familiar scene throughout Syria, and prices of food went through the roof. Syria is being driven into an enforced and dangerous food insecurity by a combination of military and economic force, both backed by the same criminal US-UK-led alliance. The health sector. While the claim is being made that the humanitarian sector is exempt from sanctions, this is misleading, and I'm being polite. Almost 50% of Syrian hospitals have been destroyed during the war in this country. Many were occupied by terrorist groups and converted into military centers, Sharia courts, detention and torture centers. For example, the Eye and Children's Hospital in East Aleppo, which was finally liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and allies in December 2016. I visited all of these restored hospitals, restored to free Syria, really free Syria. An estimated 20 pharmaceutical factories were also destroyed or occupied during the terrorist invasions. Syria had a fleet of 703 ambulances in 2011. 350 have been destroyed or stolen by the armed groups or their Western-backed auxiliary, the White Helmets. The remaining hospitals and equipment are suffering from lack of updated technology, parts, and maintenance because, again, the majority of the hardware was supplied originally by the EU. This has led, of course, to the scarcity of drugs for chronic illnesses like cancer, heart disease, kidney disease. The health sector, which offered a free healthcare, I would say definitely comparable to what was being talked about in Cuba, has always been a source of pride for the Syrian state. Now, 41 public hospitals and 621 medical centers are out of commission. There are restrictions on, for example, on the import of chlorine gas used as a water purifier, which has resulted in the spread of infectious diseases due to the pollution of drinking water. At the same time, NATO member state Turkey is deliberately depriving Syrian people of water in the Hasaka region by shutting off the water from the Euphrates. The sanctions are, again, only one element of a war of hydro-hegemony waged by the US coalition against the Syrian people. Sorry, my cat always likes to join in. A war that impacts upon the health sector with devastating consequences. The most recent and savage Caesar Act sanctions introduced under Trump are preventing the rebuilding of hospitals and repair of essential machinery. The closure of many of the rural hospitals is leading to inevitable overcrowding of city hospitals, resulting in delays in treatment and the spread of disease. Sanctions on the health sector are a deliberate and criminal targeting of the Syrian people by the US coalition. And this violates all human rights conventions. It must be condemned. The electricity and transport sectors, which again has an impact on the health sector. The electricity sectors have been devastated by a combination of war and sanctions. There's been a drastic lowering of output, which is affected by the lack of fuel, thanks to the occupation of oil resources and inability to source spare parts. Damages in 2015 due to electricity outages were estimated at $16 billion. Now in 2021, that figure will be hugely increased. armed groups dominated by Nusra Front have systematically destroyed electrical power stations, fuel warehouses, gas and oil pipelines, and stolen entire power grids to trade inside Turkey. Entire railway lines have been torn up and melted down, again inside Turkey, or sold as scrap. The Syrian transport system is affected by lack of fuel, spare parts, and destruction of essential infrastructure. All of these have a debilitating knock-on effect on Syrian society and how it functions. An overall view, there have been huge price hikes in food across Syria, around 300 to 500% increases in some instances. Fuel prices have gone through the roof. Inflation is really only just under control. This is all engendering food insecurity, malnutrition, and poverty among 80% of the population. Wages have remained static, so an average government employee is earning around 50,000 Syrian pounds per month, $16 at today's rate. While, for example, 2 kilos of chicken is now 20,000 Syrian pounds. So you have a very good idea of how malnutrition the majority of families, 80% of families, will be in Syria. In the winter, many areas of Damascus were receiving electricity for only 3 hours per day. In rural areas, even less. The cost of heating, fuel, and gas for cooking is now extortionate. For one gas bottle on the black market, between 30 to 40,000 Syrian pounds, while there are long waits for subsidized government-supplied gas. There is a shortage of fuel, which has led to queues of up to 2 days to receive 20 liters of fuel. Lebanon is now also running out of fuel, having been one of the main suppliers of black market fuel to Syria. Iran, that is trying to break the embargo on Syria with fuel tankers, is of course always coming under attack by the US coalition and is regularly escorted by Russia for security. Unemployment is rising exponentially. Apartment rental costs have soared while the building of new projects are on hold due to lack of materials, equipment, and investment. Families are being torn apart because young people are risking the dangers of illegal travel routes to the EU and beyond to try to earn money to send back to their impoverished relatives in Syria. The sanctions are suffocating Syria, and they are being used to deliberately increase the suffering of the Syrian people who have resisted 10 years of war waged against them by the US-UK coalition that is ensuring their inability to rise out of the quagmire of that war. The US coalition is effectively following a policy of collective extermination of the Syrian people by military and economic means. This is a crime against humanity, a war crime, and a flagrant violation of the right to life and a life of dignity. Syria is a member of the United Nations. These coercive unilateral measures targeting the people of Syria are a violation of the UN Charter. Under the most recent and barbaric Caesar sanctions, considered by many experts to be illegal, greater pressure is being brought to bear against nations who would try to help Syria rebuild. At the same time, the US, UK, EU, Turkey, and Israel continue to support and promote terrorism in Syria and enable their proxies to pillage and plunder Syrian resources, further punishing the Syrian people. The sanctions against Syria are a malevolent attempt to bring the country to its knees after one of the most protracted and expensive UK-US-led regime change wars has failed militarily. The sanctions are not affecting the alleged targets. They are killing the Syrian people and they are killing their hope for the future. We must campaign against them to restore peace and stability to Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Vanessa, for that extremely sobering report. Let us remember, those of us who are in Canada, that Canada is an absolutely enthusiastic supporter of the so-called coalition, that is barbaric coalition that is exterminating the Syrian people. So on that unhappy note, let's move on to Iran. Oh, wonderful! We can all see you well, Mohammed. So let me introduce Professor Mohammed Marandi. He's an Iranian-American academic and political analyst, professor of English literature, Orientalism, and American Studies at the University of Tehran in Iran, who has served as Minister of Health and Member of Parliament in Iran as well. Professor Marandi has published widely on topics of his expertise, appears regularly as a political and social commentator, on international news networks such as PBS, RT, ABC, CGTN, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Press TV. So without further ado, Mohammed, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Of course, I was not a member of parliament or the minister of health. That is another Marandi, but,
Oh
but in any case, no problem. The rest is correct. The rest is absolutely correct.
Okay.
So, yes, after Vanessa's very good presentation, I don't feel that there is much to say, but I would like to make a few general comments. And that is that what justifies the atrocities that are being committed in Syria is the fact that Western regimes, I would call them, because that is how they like to delegitimize their own targets by calling them regimes and thus legitimizing their own actions against nations across the world. So I usually refer to Western governments as Western regimes to sort of reciprocate. Western regimes and the affiliated media and think tanks, what they generally do is that they use a particular narrative in order to legitimize their acts, such as the use of the word regime. One such narrative is to call Syria a police state, or to say that Assad has gassed his own people, or to say that Assad has the blood of his own, he's killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. This language is used to justify genocide, to justify crimes against humanity. Regardless of the fact that I've been to Syria often, and Vanessa has been living there for years, and she could attest to this. You can speak more openly in Syria than you can in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. In the Emirates, if you say something favorable about Qatar, the country Qatar, the small country Qatar, which is a dot on the map, you can go to jail for years and you can be fined for over $100,000. Or, for example, we see the Israeli regime, their subjugation of the Palestinian people, let's say in the West Bank. That is a police state. In Syria, you have a government which every time well, on many occasions, but every time that there was an alleged gas attack, the government was on the verge of a military victory. And then as soon as it is about to defeat ISIS or Al-Qaeda or their affiliates, such as Jaish al-Islam in some area, suddenly, lo and behold, the Syrian government decides to do the most stupid thing possible and carry out a gas attack so that the Americans could strike them, so that they can have the opportunity to strike them. And then, of course, as you all probably know, the OPCW, the OPCW scandal, the whistleblowers that have shown that the alleged gas attack on Duma was fabricated and a false flag operation. And I can go on about other gas attacks and what happened as well, but I'll leave it at that. So the whole gas attack narrative is discredited. The police state narrative, US allies such as Egypt are police states. And then the argument about Assad killing his own people. It is like saying that the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, who are fighting the terrorist contra rebels, who are sort of like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and their affiliates. It's like saying that when they fight them and people die in the battlefields or people die in the cities, innocent people die in the cities where there's fighting, that the Sandinistas and Ortega have blood on their hands. Well, if they have blood on their hands, those countries that supported the Sandinista rebels they have even more blood on their hands. So if Assad is a criminal, then the Prime Minister of Canada is a much worse criminal. then the President of the United States is a much worse criminal. Then the President of Turkey is a much worse criminal. Then the Prime Minister of Israel is a much worse criminal, and the list goes on. So these narratives, which are either false or misleading, I'm not saying that Syria is a democracy. No state that is under siege, both through a dirty war and through sanctions, is going to behave in a normal manner. And many of the non-democratic or dictatorships that we have in this region are much more authoritarian than anything that we see in Syria, yet they are very, very, very good allies of the United States. Presidents meet them, prime ministers meet them, ministers meet them, and they trade extensively and they cooperate across the board with these countries. So these are rhetorical means and methods through which Western governments and their regional allies, which are mostly authoritarian regimes, whether it's the apartheid regime in Palestine, or Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates, or Turkey with President Erdogan, which is a complicated country, but he is an authoritarian figure himself. Netanyahu, of course, being Netanyahu. Syria, this narrative is either completely dishonest or very misleading, but it is all created to justify genocide. I remember in Yemen, and I don't know if the rest of you recall, but during the first 3 or 4 years of the war in Yemen, the Western media would always say 10,000 people have died in Yemen. For 3 or 4 years, this number wouldn't be touched. It was always, so after the genocide, after the Saudi bombing, after the US Navy and the on civilians, the schools, the hospitals, the funerals, the school buses, after all these were bombed, there was only 10,000 people who were, you'd constantly see the number 10,000 in the Western media. Why? Because Western countries, Western regimes and their allies, when they want to carry out atrocities, they want to diminish the magnitude, such as in Yemen, and elsewhere, they, like in Syria, they want to hide their role in committing these atrocities and supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups by projecting their own criminal behavior on the other side, such as I said, in Syria. We know that the United States was supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. How do we know it? From the fact that in an email on February the 12th or 14th of 2012, Jake Sullivan, the current national security advisor of Biden, said that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. He said this to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at that time, literally a decade after 9/11. We know from a leaked audio tape by Kerry, the Secretary of State at the time, that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on President Assad. We know that from Obama in an interview that he carried out, that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus so that they could put pressure on the Iraqi prime minister. And the list goes on. We know from Biden's own speech in 2014 in Harvard that they knew exactly what their allies in the region were doing in Syria and Iraq and supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is all from the US Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012. This is all common knowledge. But when this was actually happening, did any of the American and European reporters in Istanbul point this out? A former senior British intelligence agent who some of you may know, but I won't name him because I don't know if I'm authorized to say this on his behalf. I don't think he would have a problem with this. But in 2011, I was in Beirut, and he happened to be in Beirut at that time. And he said that this operation is a regime change operation. And I asked him in Syria, and I asked him why. And he said, I used to work in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 1980s. And the very same people who were there carrying out a regime change operation are now in Istanbul. Do you think it's possible that Western media personnel had no knowledge of this? An Iranian reporter, Surina Shim, she was working for Press TV on the Turkish border with Syria. She reported in 2014, and she is a Lebanese she's a Lebanese American. She was Lebanese American, a young 39-year-old woman with 2 children. She was on the Turkish-Syrian border in 2014, and she said on live television for Press TV, the Iranian English news channel, that the Turkish intelligence is using World Food Organization trucks that belong to the UN to take in troops and equipment into Syria for ISIS. In another report, soon afterwards, she said Turkish intelligence has accused me of spying, of being a spy, and I'm worried. Hours later, she was murdered. Hours later, she had a so-called car accident and died. Did a single American reporter in Turkey pursue this? Did a single Western American reporter pursue this? Did a single mainstream journalist tweet this or retweet this? No. The UN was being used by NATO to help ISIS. A Lebanese American citizen journalist, a young woman with 2 children, reported this, was accused of spying, died soon afterwards, and we don't even hear about this. This is the reality of the world that we live in. One final point that I'd like to point out, and that is another trope that is used to justify these crimes against humanity, sanctions, is to accuse the sanctioned country of corruption. That is basic. So they try to say, no, we're not killing people. It's because of the incompetence of that country. So they strangle the country and they accuse the country of being corrupt. Corruption exists in all countries. And indeed, in countries that are sanctioned, corruption will increase because people become impoverished. So they steal. Or when the normal means for exporting and importing medicine cannot be used, when you cannot use banks, people have to circumvent the sanctions and they're carried out underground, there are less checks and balances. So the chances for corruption obviously increase. But this is a direct result of the sanctions. So whether it is police state, whether it is killing his or her own people, whether it is gassing their own people, whether it is corruption, all of these tropes are used to justify genocide. And those reporters and media outlets that use those, the same ones that constantly say regime, the Syrian regime, the Iranian regime, the Venezuelan regime, the Cuban regime, whenever you hear regime from these Western media outlets, you can be sure that it's propaganda. So all of these tropes are used to justify war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as Vanessa rightly pointed out, we have to work hard to counter these, but we also have to be courageous in standing up to these tropes and to pointing out that the real war criminals are actually the ones who are making the accusations against the victims. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, very, very much for setting the record straight in a range of things, and we will follow up with the questions. We will move on with Venezuela, Syria. Cira Pascual Marquina is political science professor at the Universidad Bolivariana de Venezuela. Bolivarian University of Venezuela in Caracas, and a writer and editor for Venezuela Analysis. She's also co-producer and co-host with Chris Gilbert of the Marxist education program Escuela de Cuadros, broadcast weekly on the Venezuelan television station Vive and on the Alba TV dial, a social movements channel. Sida writes for outlets such as Rebelión, La Haine, and Counterpunch, and is author with Chris Gilbert of Venezuela, the Present as Struggle, a recent book published in 2020 by Monthly Review Press. She's also co-compiler of two books, Para qué sirve el capital? I'm sorry, I can't think of how to translate that. What is the purpose of capital, I suppose? A contemporary balance of the main work of Karl Marx, and why socialism reactivating the debate. So welcome, Sira, take it away.
So I will actually shorten what I wanted to say because we have taken enough time because of our bad connection. But I wanted to begin by highlighting that the sanctions that Venezuela is going through right now, they formally began the financial sanctions in 2017, but the option of regime change has been on the table, and the action in regards to regime change has been on the table for the US and its allies, at least since 2002, when there was a coup against Hugo Chavez, and the US and other allies like the Spanish state supported that coup. Then after that, there were many instances of non-recognition of electoral results, and of course, a lot of support for the opposition. But in 2015, with Obama, with what we call the Obama decree, Venezuela was declared an unusual and extraordinary threat. And at that point, the US set up what we would call symbolic sanctions. Symbolic sanctions targeting public figures, politicians. Basically, the assets, if they had any assets in the US, were frozen, and they were banned from traveling to the US. This had an impact, a political impact, but it didn't have the economic impact that the financial sanctions that would be imposed in August of 2017 would have. So basically, in August 2017, the Trump administration locked Venezuela out of the financial markets, precisely when it was most needed. I should add here that Venezuela has been in a crisis of the capitalist rentier model since 2014, more or less, when the prices of oil dropped down very quickly. And I say that it's a crisis of the capitalist rentier model because, as Chavez himself would say, what we did with the Bolivarian process was to put certain limits to the expansion of capitalism, but we never actually constructed a socialist society. You know? Basically, in 2017, the sanctions are imposed. Basically, Venezuela becomes toxic to do business with Venezuela. What does it mean? Of course, first and foremost, U.S. corporations are banned from doing anything in Venezuela. This is important because Venezuela is, as you all know, an oil-producing country, and its main business partner in terms of the purchase of oil was the United States. But Venezuela becomes toxic because, as it is the case with Cuba, if a company that's not a US company wants to do business with Venezuela, and if it does business with Venezuela, then it gets sanctions. So the financial sanctions, in principle, are sanctions by and for the US and by actually Canada too. But it actually ends up meaning that many countries that are not formally signers of sanctions also end up participating in them. The financial sanctions and later the oil sanctions have had amongst other actions that have been taken by the US are the blocking of the assets of the Venezuelan oil company Citgo, a US company, a Venezuelan held company in the US, operating in the US. And also England, the Bank of England is retaining currently 31 tons of gold. This gold has been tried to reclaim it because this gold could be used for buying the stuff that we need to take care of the COVID crisis, but we have not been able to access, Venezuela has not been able to access its own gold, which is deposited in the Bank of England. So that's in 2017. In January 2019, you may remember that Juan Guaido self-proclaimed president. He was backed by the US, and very shortly after that happened, the US imposed oil sanctions, an oil embargo and full oil sanctions on Venezuela. So this goes hand in hand with, this is both financial, we have now political, financial, and oil sanctions on Venezuela. And what have been the impacts of this situation? You cannot understand, I have to close down. I guess I have to close down, right? Because they say here that they cannot understand.
Yeah, well, you're breaking
Tell
down
me if you,
again.
if I should go on or not, because I hear, I see here that somebody is saying that they cannot understand.
Yeah, there's some people who are texting me or chatting through the chat that it's breaking down again. We got a little bit, Sira. Let's do the following. I think that if we move on to the Q&A and through the questions, you can elaborate and it'll be less, better, right? Because we can hear you like a little bit and then it breaks down again. So let me just say that if you can stay around, just stick around, and let's see if with the Q&A you can elaborate on some of the points, like the closing points, and I can, let me just do the following. I'm gonna, reproduce a little bit of what you said, Sira, that the sanctions, they're recent, but they're not new, and they go back to the attempt to destabilize the government, the socialist government, and the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, going back to 2002, and probably at least since, and even earlier maybe, but certainly 2002 with the failed coup d'etat. So Sira is reporting that while sanctions started under Obama, they were mostly symbolic at the time, meaning targeting specific officials, but now it's become a sanctions regime attacking the whole of the economy, but importantly, not directly sanctioning Venezuela only, but rather through the secondary sanctions. So anybody who does business with Venezuela gets sanctioned, and that's a very common strategy as a sanctions policy. So we can follow up with the specific details of that as we move on to the Q&A that Sira can elaborate on. So thank you very much, everyone. We're going to move on to the Q&A. We have about half an hour left, and we tend to stay a little longer if people stick around, maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. So would anybody like to follow up with the speakers? Let's see if I can get a question. There's a lot of comments here. Deadly instruments. I don't see a question, but if people want to, or the easiest would be to just unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask a question. I can't see everyone on the screen though. I know we have about
raised, Claudia, if you look at
yes.
the participants list, I can see 3 people who have raised their hands.
Okay, so I'm looking at the list here.
Go to the top of the participants list.
Yeah, the top of the participant list. Okay, so we have John and then Arnold and then Carlos and then Rudra. So let's do that. Let's go ahead first with John. Please go ahead. John Ross.
Yeah, firstly, can I say this is absolutely excellent, and congratulations to the Manifesto Group for organising it, because it gives loads of information and it's very harrowing, but nevertheless vital information. I've got a question, a genuine question. That's not a rhetorical question, or something I really don't understand, which I want to ask to John Perry about Nicaragua, which is in the context of a more general point I'm going to make. Right? Okay. The question which I cannot understand is, given that is why Nicaragua continues to recognise as a country the province of Taiwan. I mean, because this blocks off Nicaragua from any help from China. And this seems to me a really quite crazy policy, given the general policies of the Nicaraguan government. And I really don't understand it. And I'm never asking John a real question, is why does it do this? Right, okay. Then the more general point I want to make in this context is the seriousness of these sanctions shows why the international approach, which is based on basically the slogan of neither Washington nor Beijing, is nonsense. The only countries which are powerful enough to break through the sanctions is not the Western European or the United States solidarity movement. They don't remotely have the power to do it, right? The countries, the only places with power, which that, for example, on Venezuela has been done to some extent, not sufficiently. One can make all sorts of comments, but nevertheless, importantly, on vaccines, economic aid, etc., is China and Russia, right? Therefore, this approach of the West, some of the Western left, of neither Washington nor Beijing, as they tend to put it, I mean, you can add on Moscow if you want, but anyway, neither Washington nor Beijing, is absolute nonsense from the point of view of people. You don't even have to agree, for example, that China is a socialist country. You can have whatever analysis you want. But the idea of placing an equation sign between China and Washington is absolutely deadly for countries, particularly facing sanctions. So that's the general point that I'd make. But perhaps, as it is a great mystery to me, John could answer the thing about Taiwan. Thank you.
Shall I go ahead, Claudia?
Yes, please go ahead, John.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the question in any detail. I'll just make the point, I think, that it's a priority for the Nicaraguan government to maintain good relations with every other government. So that, for example, it has good relations with the other governments in Central America, many of which are very right-wing. And I think it's got diplomatic status in practically every country in the world. It's trying to balance, as I understand it, its relationships between the Chinese Republic and Taiwan, because, for example, China was involved in the proposed interoceanic canal that may not be going ahead now, but it was certainly under development a few years ago. The relationship with Taiwan has been very important because Taiwan has been very, very helpful during the COVID period. And for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, which gives soft loans to Latin American countries, has been giving loans to Nicaragua to buy supplies and vaccines to deal with COVID that have been backed by Taiwan. So I think it's simply part of their general diplomatic strategy to keep good relations with everyone and use the links with Asian countries, China and Russia as well, to help counteract the effects of US sanctions.
That's a good point. Is that more or less cover the question, John? I actually asked myself that question when I was visiting, because I talked to many of the peasants and the people who grow, the small plots of land, etc., and they had very, friendly and positive feelings towards Taiwan. But Taiwan was is very involved locally, and there are, groups and even like citizen groups, like sending and actively helping people on the ground. And we're talking about a very poor country, right? So, and there may be other, it's a very good question. And there may be, some way, John, that maybe John Perry, that maybe you could, sort of try to find out for us and then pass back the information. It's, it's very critical, right? And China, of course, as, we all know, is the only country at the moment able to, strike back on the sanctions regime imposed by the West. For instance, recently, sanctioning several US and EU, if I'm citing correctly, officials, right? Sanctioning them. So it's the only one able to turn the weapons of sanctions against the sanctioning regimes. John, Ross, anything else you'd like to follow up with?
No, that's fine. No.
Yeah. It's a very interesting point. So the next one was Arnold. Please go ahead, Arnold. And John, could you, if you don't have the question, if you could put down your electronic hand. I'm still seeing it. Arnold?
Thank you, Claudia. This is really great. I definitely am interested in joining the International Manifesto Group. I have one point to make. I'll make it very short. It's on the issue of sanctions against Cuba. I'll just make a few points, and then I will post a YouTube that I did on that, which goes into this in detail. Now, while it is true, as Sarah said, and everyone is saying, that Canada does not have sanctions against Cuba, but the facts show that Canada encourages indirectly American sanctions against Cuba. For example, there have been 252 such sanctions against Cuba during the Trump administration, and the Trudeau administration has spoken up very feebly on only one, on the issue of the territorial aspect of the sanction, because it affects Canadian businesses. But everything else, even when the United States took the very brazen, provocative measure of changing the nationality of a American producer of products that can help the Cubans, and thus cut off that possibility, Canada did not say a word. When there was a request by the Manitoba Chiefs to have the help of a Cuban medical service and medication, Canada rejected. We know why, to curry favor with the United States, who has an open policy against that. So there are many other reasons, just to mention, for example, Trudeau is not that well known, but the Trudeau government had two opportunities during the Trump administrations in the United Nations to call out the United States with regards to sanctions. Instead, what they do, they called out Venezuela. And there, same thing happened when Vice Pence was in Ottawa. There was the opportunity, right? He did not mention a word against the sanctions, but of course, they both called out Venezuela. Anyways, I just want to bring this up as something that we might want to integrate in future discussion, that how Canada indirectly, in a hypocritical manner, is throwing Cuba under the bus in order to please the United States. And I'll put my YouTube on that very shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arnold, for that, very necessary clarification. There's many ways, and I've learned some of them through you and the multiple books you've written and blogs and articles, and also read Zengler, of the many sort of more subtle and say indirect and pseudo-friendly ways in which Canadian government supports the policies of the United States. So that's always good to remind ourselves about. The next one is Carlos. Please go ahead, Carlos. And Arnold, would you lower your hand unless you have, yes, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thanks very much to all the presenters. I thought really, really interesting, really insightful presentations and discussions so far. And I was especially glad to see Sarah Kendall, who's someone whose YouTube presence I came across, maybe this time last year. She's done some fantastic videos that I'd encourage people to seek out in relation to the Cuban medical system. Really fascinating stuff. I wanted to come in very quickly on this thing of Nicaragua and Taiwan, just to basically say that, like most such things, it's very complicated with different historical aspects to it. Nicaragua had very close relations with Taiwan under the Somoza dynasty, of course. And then when the Sandinistas first came to power, they were aligned essentially with the Soviet Union, Cuba and Vietnam, all of which had extremely bad relations with China because of the Sino-Soviet split. Good relations were starting to be established before the FSLN fell from power. But then the right-wing government that succeeded it re-established ties with Taiwan. And then when the FSLN came back, Taiwan was, up until a few years ago, Taiwan was the biggest foreign investor in Nicaragua, with lots of major Taiwanese companies being employers, especially in the textile sector. At that time, the Kuomintang was in power in Taiwan, and China and Taiwan were establishing better relations and had come to some sort of consensus that they wouldn't try and sort of steal diplomatic recognition from each other. So that's changed now with the DPP government. I suspect there'll be a change in the Nicaraguan policy in the coming years, but obviously it's not the highest priority. But like all these things, but very, very complicated, but a lot of it comes down to the Sino-Soviet split. And I just wanted to ask Sarah in relation to Cuba and the problems that are being created by sanctions. To what degree is it actually possible for friendly countries to bypass these sanctions? Obviously, these are unilateral sanctions, which the US is able to impose and has various means that it can apply, such as the Helms-Burton Act and whatnot. But to what degree can China, for example, bypass sanctions, or Russia? There have been really important developments in recent years regarding Cuban-Chinese cooperation in medicine and biotech. The two countries run this joint biotech innovation center in Hunan, which is a really good way of bypassing the sanctions regime because the physical infrastructure is all Chinese and the project takes place in China, but Cuba provides personnel and scientific knowledge and expertise. And the two of them are actually working on probably the most promising vaccine overall, which is called the pan-corona vaccine, which is specifically designed to stimulate antibodies by using the parts of the virus that aren't susceptible to mutation. So the vaccine wouldn't be vulnerable to mutations, which is a very, very innovative, very interesting thing. It was reported in January that since the start of the pandemic, the Chinese government has provided over 80 tons of medical supplies to Cuba. And presumably that number's gone up since then. And I'm guessing that it's quite difficult for the US to impose sanctions directly on the Chinese government. I mean, in terms of the tools, the weapons that it has, what's it going to do? Stop China from buying US Treasury bonds? So from that perspective, it feels like it shouldn't be necessary for Cuba to suffer these kind of critical shortages of syringes or ventilators. And is there a good reason why the problem isn't simply solved via Cuba's friends in China, in Russia, in Venezuela, and elsewhere? Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for I think you're the reason that Claudia and I were able to connect in the first place, so thank you. And I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question. However, it is more, I think that sometimes, like with the macro narrative that creates an illusion that was being spoken to with these terms regime and with these kind of this imagination that gets created in the consciousness outside of countries that are affected by sanctions. There is a notion of the impossibility of direct support. And so I think that that's actually a huge piece of what's in the way. For instance, even from a country like Canada that does, explicitly and implicitly support the US regime's tactics, I think that Canadians and folks in countries all over the planet can more easily than is understood directly provide support to Cuba, and probably other countries in the same vein. The trick is always going to be about these really kind of crafty ways that the United States does mobilize the sanctions, so that they're doing a tax on anyone who has an interface with the American dollar at any point that they can find them relating with the American dollar. So in terms of actually how to send money and materials, that becomes really difficult. So banks, you probably know more about this than I do, but banks in Europe are kind of occasionally hunted down and then accused and attacked on legal levels. And it makes it really hard to have the necessary intermediaries. That said, China and other countries are involved in direct foreign investment in Cuba through direct partnerships. And they, like you say, both in China, but also inside Cuba, those partnerships are continuing. And the port of the Muriel, which is like, Mariel, actually, Mariel, that's going to be a huge port that already has more than 20 countries actively participating. And it's kind of a slow and difficult process, but I think it's going to be the biggest port in the area. And folks can provide direct support, but it's about being very careful because, for instance, if there's more than 10% of the product comes from Cuba that another country uses in the production of something, the US won't have anything to do with it. So there are these really detailed ways that the sanctions and the blockade is enforced that I think becomes that, plus the international narrative of the lies about the country, become the limiting force. But if we just knew more simple ways to send containers to Cuba, then a lot more folks would be doing it.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, for instance, another example is the COVAX shipment that was stopped to Venezuela. Even if I understand correctly, China is involved in COVAX, but even if they paid for the vaccines, they can't get it because the bank, the intermediary bank, is investigating. So we have tons of very detailed and really disturbing cases of shipments and transactions being stopped. The United States is all over the place. It's almost like a cancer, throughout the world, stopping, as Sarah was describing. So let's move on to Rudra, and then we have Radhika, and then we have Kasit, in that order. Rudra, go ahead.
Good evening. Good evening. It is a wonderful panel and very insightful discussions and all that. I'm connecting from Goa, India. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Rudra.
Very, very enriching discussion. But what we understand is that sanction has always been, and mostly it has been, a very selective weapon. Most of the times. In the context of that, I would rather like to ask the opposite question, the question of opposite of sanctions. If we look at foreign assistance, foreign aid for that matter, it will be interesting to understand that foreign assistance or international aid, wherever globally that has been given, has it been beneficial either? And recently I was delivering a lecture in India, and I had to compute the statistical data to find out, put together as to what is the quantum of foreign assistance that has been given to the world so far. And I think the panel would be surprised to know that 9,000 billion have been disbursed so far as what you call foreign assistance and international aid, ODAs and something. 9,000 billion is a mind-boggling figure. World population today is 7.7 billion people in the world. 9,000 billion have already been dispersed in a period of 60 years. Now, where has it gone? Has it benefited anybody? So when you're talking about the sanctions, I think the opposite the what we call the narrative of economic benefit that has been assisted to countries or the people or the societies in the name of foreign assistance or international aid, or you call it as official development assistance, and all of them together, they themselves have not really been beneficial to humankind, to people and societies, be it in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, wherever they have been. So when the foreign assistance has not, statistically, if I understand it correctly, it has not been beneficial. Sanctions, of course, are weapons of, they're all mischievous weapons of geopolitical advantage to be gained. And that's where I think the narrative has to be, slightly maybe, can be moderated in that context. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudra, very much for that important point. In fact, we should include a related, panel on the role of foreign assistance in the regime change NGO world complex, international complex that has played an important role in all these countries, funding NGOs that are involved in regime change. That's a very interesting point. Let's move on to Radhika, unless people have anything to, oh, okay. Vanessa, would you like to comment on that? I see your hand. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's a very salient point, and it's actually something that I wanted to include in my presentation, but I had to condense it down. But people may be aware, of course, of the wrangling at the UN between Russia and Syria and the US and France and EU and Canada, etc., about the cross-border humanitarian aid supply into Idlib, which, of course, even Brett McGurk has described as the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. So you have around between 2 to 3 million.
I think so. Yeah.
Somebody who needs to be muted. David. Yes, please, Vanessa, go ahead.
Under the control of 100,000 plus armed groups led by Al-Qaeda, dominated by Al-Qaeda under various rebrands. Of course, the US has continuously tried to kind of whitewash and clean the image of the armed groups that they are supporting inside Syria. But it's a well-known fact, for example, that one of the reasons that, of course, Russia and Syria are trying to prevent humanitarian aid supply into areas under the control of the armed groups is because these supplies, as Serena Shim pointed out in 2014, are far from being humanitarian aid. At that point, they were weapons, they were terrorists, they were supplies and equipments to the armed groups. But also the Bab al-Hawa crossing, which is one of the main Syria-Turkey cross-border areas, which was visited by Kelly Clark, the UN ambassador under the Trump administration, where she proudly showed it as the humanitarian flagship of aid entering Syria, is actually one of the main trading points for Al-Qaeda. So the aid comes into Bab al-Hawa, it's taken by Al-Qaeda and it's used to generate revenue. It doesn't actually reach the Syrian people. And the same thing is happening in Yemen. The Yemeni health minister, various officials and authorities in Yemen have described the process of aid that never reaches the actual Yemeni people. It gets absorbed either by the armed groups that are under control of Saudi Arabia, effectively by the US coalition. And this is an ongoing pattern, and as you said, in all these regime change wars, in every single occupied area in Syria, the so-called humanitarian aid that was allowed to enter was being stockpiled by the terrorist groups. Civilians were not receiving any of that humanitarian aid. For example, in Aleppo, after liberation, they found warehouses, or they filled a warehouse with 5,000 tons of humanitarian medical aid. The civilians never saw anything of this. So effectively, this humanitarian aid is providing revenue for the terrorist proxies supported and promoted, of course, by the aligned media and by the nation states, the regimes, as Mohammed said, that are destroying these countries that are in their crosshairs. So it's a very interesting figure of 9,000 billion I mean, we know that the UK, for example, is boasting about the fact that in Syria they've spent in the region of about 3 billion now in so-called humanitarian aid. So it's a very good question, and it's something we should investigate. Where exactly is this money going? What is it being used for? And why is there so rarely any accountability from these so-called NGOs, as we've seen recently, of course, with the white homeless?
Very important point, Vanessa. Thank you for that. Anybody else in the panel would like to, any of the speakers would like to make a comment on the point of the abuse of foreign assistance? Or your views on it, or your views on it? Yes, please, go ahead, Mohammed, go ahead.
Yes, I think not only should we add the issue of foreign aid, which is being sent to Al-Qaeda, or in the case of Yemen, where the aid is being sent to Saudi and Emirati-backed militias, but also the assets of the countries themselves are being used against their own citizens. So, for example, in the case of Syria, Syria was an oil exporter before 2011 and 12. Now it is reliant basically on Iranian oil. So the Iranians have to send tankers, and the EU tries to block them, as we've seen before. The Americans try to block them, and the Israelis try to strike them to prevent the fuel from getting to the Syrian people, because they want to be able to shut down the country completely, to literally make people starve. But before Iran was sending this fuel, the Syrians were using their own fuel. They were exporting some, they were using their own oil and exporting the excess amounts that they were producing. Now that oil, 90% of it, is in areas that is occupied by the United States and their proxies. And that oil is exported through the militias into Turkey. So part of that revenue goes to Turkey, part of it goes to the United States, part of it goes to its proxies, and part of it goes to Al-Qaeda affiliate and allies that are linked to Turkey and Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region. So Syrian oil, which is for the Syrian people, and Vanessa, as she pointed out earlier, not only is Turkey blocking the rivers from flowing into Syria as normal, but the agricultural products that are being produced in northeastern Syria, the area occupied by the United States, are forbidden from being taken into Syria. So the Americans are literally trying to starve Syria. They're trying and this is nothing new, because that's what they're doing in Yemen as well. The naval siege that the Americans and the Saudis imposed was to block anything from coming into the country. The same tool is used against Iran. The same sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign, is there to crush the Iranian economy, to make it like it was under Saddam Hussein. But Iran is a larger country, and I think that the government or the state has been able to deal with the sanctions through both regional allies, trade, and also local production. So the Iranians are better at this than the Syrians or others. But the example of Cuba is also a good example. The Cubans probably are, along with the Syrians, are facing the most severe situation, because they're literally, it's a small country surrounded, but they've been able to use the limited means at their disposal to survive. So this is what we are seeing, is aid coming in from Western countries. It is sort of an extension of what I was saying earlier, the narrative, about gassing their own people and regimes, and the nonsense about police states and killing their own people and so on. This is a part of that broader narrative. That narrative is used to legitimize terror, to legitimize war, to legitimize brutal sanctions. And then this aid that is provided, but it's actually provided for the terrorists, is also there to mislead global public opinion that they're actually trying to do some good here, where in fact this is a part of the war that they're waging against ordinary people.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that comment. John, yeah, it's very, very important. And also the stopping of the aid, correct? Like the Venezuelan envoy who's now languishing in a prison, courtesy of the Americans in Africa, in Cape Verde, if I'm correct, because it was trying to get help from Iran, real help, right? Iran's ships got shot down when they were, not shot, at least attacked, or like piracy operations in the sea when they were trying to help the Venezuelans. Is that correct, Mohammed?
Many people are in jail because of Americans and Western sanctions. So the Europeans help arrest them, the Australians, New Zealand, and other countries that are bullied by the Americans, they arrest Iranians, Venezuelans, and others who are working to circumvent the sanctions. Some of them are just business people who are trying to make money. Some of them are people who are affiliated to the government who are trying to help bring in aid. But the shocking thing is that there is no talk about these people in the Western media. So if someone is arrested in Venezuela, you know, that becomes a household name. If some Westerner in Iran, at a time when you see sabotage in Iran, assassinations in Iran, if someone from the West is arrested in Iran, she becomes a household name. But you have lots of Iranians right now, lots of Venezuelans, not one or two, many. The person who you mentioned is more high profile, but you have a lot of people arrested in different parts of the world, even in countries like Malaysia, who are languishing in jail, but no one knows about them. And the only way that they will one day be freed is for, you know, for this side, the resistance, whether in West Asia, North Africa, or in Central America, to be able to force a prisoner exchange through arresting people who are working for the empire, trying to undermine their countries. So again, this is one of those things. In the case of Iran, they're constantly saying these Westerners who are in Iran who are being held hostage, but you don't hear anything about Iranians or Iranian Americans or Venezuelans who are being held hostage by the antagonists of these countries.
Thank you, Mohammed. Let me just say a practical thing. I'm completely happy to stay on, and I believe we are, the organizers, for another half hour. And of course, those who have to leave also, I would like to make it possible, given that we have this stellar panel available from all parts of the world. We don't get that very often. Just invite people to stay. We have a comment from John Perry, probably addressing, John, this question or point you'd like to address. The NGO regime change complex. I don't know if that's the one that he wanted to comment on. And then we have a question from Radhika, and then a question from Kasit. And that probably will take us another, 15 or 20 minutes, and we can move on. Yes,
Claudia,
go ahead, John.
Go
ahead, John.
I just wanted to mention this point about people getting arrested and it being very prominent in the Western media. And that, of course, has happened to us in Nicaragua in the last few weeks, where there have been many arrests of people who are promoting further violence and regime change. And this comes back to the role of USAID, because USAID has been engaged in two kinds of regime change activity. One is to train local young people in using social media to provoke false news about Nicaragua. And this has been particularly successful during the COVID period, when they persuaded people not to go to hospital because they would catch COVID if they went to hospital. And there was all sorts of fake news about COVID that was promoted by effectively using US money. And the other one is the promotion of so-called independent media, which of course aren't independent at all. They're right-wing opposition media who will never, ever say anything favorable about the Sandinista government. And it's the media people and the leaders of the groups that were involved in the violence in 2018 that have now been arrested because they're believed to be planning further insurrectionary measures during the run-up to the November elections. This has been characterized in the Western press as Daniel Ortega taking out of circulation people who are opposed to him and who threaten his presidency if they stand in the elections. This is complete rubbish. None of them were yet accepted as candidates for any political party, but also the Western media ignore the fact that Daniel Ortega is leading very strongly in the opinion polls and will almost certainly win the elections in November, whatever happens. At the moment, the latest poll shows that he's got 66% of public opinion behind him, and the opposition has only got about 20%, even if it could unite behind a single candidate. So it's yet another example, and several speakers have mentioned this, how the Western media fails to dig behind the stories that they're promoting, and it's becoming a very, very serious problem. They have no interest in really examining what's going on in the countries that we're talking about. And I think this has been very clear in Nicaragua in the last few weeks, as it's always been in relation to the other countries that we're discussing today.
That's a very important point, John. Thank you for bringing it up. If I may add, John wrote a terrific answer to the journal The Lancet, which I follow in my free time. I make myself miserable, showing how, looking at how they reproduce, they legitimize. It's not just the media. The Lancet is leading the charge against all the countries that we're talking about in terms of demonizing, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes very upfront, as it happened in the case of Nicaragua. And John Todd published an article replying to that. You know, it was a very compelling. And the other one is an outlet called The Conversation, that is says to represent progressive academics, and they also lead the charge against all these countries, legitimizing the demonization and the sanctions on them. So it's very widespread. Let us move on. With Radhika has a question and Prasid has a question.
Thanks, Claudia. And again, this has been an excellent panel, excellent discussion. My questions are multiplying, but I will try to confine myself to 3. Firstly, I'd like to hear from everyone, if possible, to what extent are the other countries, such as, say, China or Russia or Iran, Turkey, etc., to what extent is aid from these countries or help of whatever sort from these countries actually able to counteract the effect of sanctions? In what ways and to what extent? Secondly, obviously, these sanctions are part of a wider regime change operation. And so, and we know that they're not without effect. They do end up having a certain amount of effect. So again, if you could reflect on what has been the effect, to what extent have they succeeded essentially in getting ordinary people to oppose the government, as is the intention. And finally, perhaps this may seem like a daft question, but we all know, of course, that the mainstream media is repeating what Western governments want them to say about their sanctions and about the aid and whatever, etc. But where do you think, but in this panel, the picture that has been created is so clear, so interesting. And what are the, apart from the slavishness of the Western media, is there any other obstacle that getting this story out, the sort of story that we are listening to in this session, what are the chief obstacles? Or maybe put it another way, what are the easiest ways of getting this story out to a wider audience? Thanks very much. And thanks again for amazing presentations and discussions and questions.
Yes, please go ahead. Who would like to go first in the panel addressing Radhika's question?
Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
Well, so the second part about how to get deal with this. I mean, I don't really have an answer to that. I think it's just networking and finding allies and partners across the global South, as well as in Western countries, to cooperate and to spread the word. But these sanctions do have a major impact. So, for example, in Iran, the sanctions prevent. There's some things that are more obvious. So, for example, hospitals, when their machines break down, spare parts are not available. And importing the spare parts are very difficult because you can't use the banking system. So you have to find these businessmen or people who will be willing to import them. And that costs a lot more. And some of them may not bring in, the real thing. There's a greater chance for corruption. But hospital equipment is the most simple. You have factories that are shut down because the supplies necessary or the machinery necessary for them to sustain their work are not available. They can't be imported, or they can't be imported on time. So many people lose jobs. And when they lose jobs, then their families fall apart, their lives fall apart. Or for example, when Iran factory exports something, and they cannot export those goods, then again the factory or the public company or the private company has to shut down. So lives are lost. Or for example, often because the medical supplies, medicine is something that has to be constantly imported, some countries will not export medicine to Iran. So certain key medical supplies are unavailable, and then people die. So you have a cancer patient who needs medicine, that medicine is not available. And then the person has to go to the black market because the person's desperate to save his or her daughter or son or whatever, or father. And then they go to the black market and then they have to buy it there. And it's not even clear if it's the real thing or not. So they pay huge, and of course, because it affects the economy, the local currency declines, and therefore goods and services become more expensive. So people lose their jobs, people have less money to spend, necessary supplies are more difficult to acquire, and often when they're acquired, it's not quite clear if it's the real thing or if it's fake or if it's an imitation of the real thing. So it affects all aspects of life. And then alongside that, you have the BBC Persian, VOA Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, Iran International, that is a Saudi channel, and a host of other TV channels, as well as an online army that's based in Albania, the MEK terrorist organization that in the 1980s fought alongside Saddam Hussein against Iran. They're Iranians who fought for Saddam Hussein. They're now working for the Americans in Albania. They're an online army. So 24 hours a day, you see psychological warfare being imposed on the country. So when Corona first broke out, you had BBC Persian showing images of people falling on the streets and dying. No one even knew where these were coming from. Were these just actors or actresses? So people were in fear because you'd see these images of just people falling and dying, and no one knew if they were real or not. Often Iranian television would go to those, find the place, and then they would say, no, there was an actor here, or this was fake, or this was staged, or whatever. But these Western media outlets, or this Western Saudi coalition, their job is to demoralize the population, to make people depressed, to make people feel that they have no future. So the sanctions on the one hand, they try to crush the country through sanctions, and it's not costly. It's in a way it's worse than Gaza, because at least in Gaza you see the atrocities and people get outraged. But when the sanctions are killing people in Syria or in Gaza or elsewhere, you don't see the people dying. It's just an ordinary death, and then people are taken to, or a husband and wife, the family collapses, the broken families. Why? Because all their lives have been devastated. So there's so many ways in which these sanctions impact the society that if I were to just think about it, I could give you different types of examples till tomorrow. And people call you, they can't find a particular medicine. Someone from living in one city, the machine in the hospital is not working, so they have to go, like, it's sort of like going from New York. You have to travel from New York to let's say Washington to find a hospital where that particular machine works, or that medicine, because there's a shortage, does not exist right now in the pharmacies in this province. So you have to go from drive from Los Angeles to, let's say, San Francisco to see if you can find the medicine in a in a drugstore or in a pharmacy over there. So the way in which it impacts people's lives is just it's so extensive, and it happens in so many ways that I just simply can't explain it. I can't hear anything right now.
No, me neither.
I'm sorry. I was muted too, and I think that Radhika was.
Oh yes,
wanted to say something.
Sorry, I was muted. So, Mohammed, what I meant is you were saying very interesting things, so I didn't want to interrupt you. But my question was slightly different. It is that to what extent are these sanctions effective in essentially turning the population against the government? I mean, obviously they're effective to some extent, but what are the general political effects is what I was thinking of. And of course, don't forget my other questions.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I think Vanessa wants to talk, but I would just say that it does have an effect, obviously, because some people, when your child dies, it's difficult to, go and say this A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and that you just blame the hospital, or you blame the administration, or whoever it is. So it does have an effect. I don't think it has the sort of effect where it will lead to the population turning against the state, but I think it leads to depression. In some cases, it may turn people against the state or the administration. In some cases, it makes people so depressed that they're simply indifferent. But I don't believe by any means it has the desired effect, because it outrages so many people that their contempt for these countries becomes irreversible.
Thank you, Mohammed. Vanessa.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'll cover the 3 points. Of course, in Syria, we talked already about the fact that Iran is supplying oil, which is basically the lifeline right now. Russia obviously is helping, probably more from a military perspective. Lebanon, we have been getting black market supplies here, but of course Lebanon was also deliberately put into economic freefall last year. They then had the Beirut port blast. So Lebanon, effectively what has happened, of course, is the US has targeted all of the so-called friendly neighbors of Syria also, in order to limit their ability to come to the aid of Syria, as we saw also last year with the forest fires. Oh God, my cat. She always likes to interrupt. But as regards, so there are always means to circumvent the sanctions, but they're difficult. And of course, with the Caesar sanctions, which are now effectively being applied to countries that are coming to the aid of Syria, of course, this is clearly an absolutely barbaric, sadistic increase in the sanctions, and an illegal extension of those sanctions to extraterritorial countries that are actually trying to assist the humanitarian situation inside Syria. So this is an important point to make. As regards the success of opposing the government, in other words, achieving the aims of sanctions, which is effectively to force the people to rise up against their own government, we had elections here And Mohammed was here in Damascus also. And I think the Syrian people sent a very clear message. Of course, they have been suffering. I've been living here for 2 years. I've been living under the sanctions. I don't pretend to understand what the poorest people here are going through, but I have visited many of them and I see what they are suffering. And they are depressed. The young people feel they have no future. Mohammed mentioned many of the effects of sanctions. But on the 26th of May, millions of Syrians took to the streets. And this was not only about re-electing President Assad. This was a message to the West to say, whatever you do, however much suffering you impose upon us, we are going to resist, right? It was a 78% turnout. Right? Of course, the West is trying to discredit the elections. They're trying to say they were a sham, which is kind of ridiculous coming from countries like the US or the UK that are complete two-party systems and effectively people don't have a choice. You know, the greatest theater is US politics and elections. But in Syria, you know, I witnessed the coming onto the streets of people that a few days before had been complaining about electricity, about the lack of bread, about the price of food, about lack of future, about rental prices, etc., etc. And this is an important point to make. People complain openly here in this so-called police state. You know, if you get into a taxi, he will tell you what he's fed up with, that he's fed up with the government, that he's fed up with not having electricity. Why can't they do this, etc. Like you would find in any normal country. But on the 26th of May, all those people put that behind them and came out onto the streets of every single city in Syria, apart from the areas under the occupation of the US and their proxies. Every single city. And those celebrations went on for about 1 week to 10 days after. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was, and I have to say, Western media has been kind of silent since then. Because this was a slap in the face of 10 years of propaganda, 10 years of sanctions, 10 years of war. And it said to the West, your opinion of us is irrelevant. We will determine our own future, we will defend our sovereignty, and we will regain our territorial integrity. Sorry, and regards the spreading the word about the criminality of sanctions. You know, sanctions don't achieve any of their aims. They are a criminal policy designed to punish collectively the people of a government that the US wants to remove from power. And heaven forbid those people support that government because they will receive the punishment. And I think the only way we can do it is, as Mohammed said, through networking, through putting the word out on as many different platforms and channels as we can. You know, we have to find alternative means. We know the mainstream media is not our friend. In fact, it is very palpably our enemy, and it's the enemy of the countries that we're talking about today. So we have to make them irrelevant. We have to become more relevant as voices of reality in this world. I don't like using the word truth because truth is very subjective, and we should always be digging deeper to find more layers of that truth because it's never black and white. But we should be actively seeking out alternative platforms to present reality, a different reality to what is being described in mainstream media, because as I said, the mainstream media is protecting power. It's not speaking truth to power, it's protecting power. And so therefore we have to take the platform away from them, make them irrelevant.
Thank you, Vanessa, very much. I mean, I personally could continue for a long time. I'd like to give the word to Cassie, who's been very patiently waiting. But let me say that just to add like a touch to what you just said, Vanessa, sanctions actually achieve a key goal, which is to inflict pain. And these are not my words. These are the words of the ideologue, the major ideologue of the sanctions regime on Iran back in 2015, and currently now in the apt hands of the Biden administration, Richard Nephew, who wrote this book, The Art of Sanctions, that I had the displeasure to read. He makes it very, very clear that one thing that we, meaning them, need to understand is a balance between the pain inflicted in the population and the so-called regime's endurance, capacity to endure and still keeping the population on their side. So it's an extremely barbaric, made polite and cleaned up strategy of oppression. So let me move on to Kasit.
Quick suggestion.
Kasit, yeah.
Claudia, I have a quick
yeah.
suggestion.
Yeah.
There are 4 hands. Just take all 4 questions and then
Okay.
the panelists respond.
Okay, let's go to Kasit, and maybe we can make that's a good idea, Radhika. Thank you. So Kasit, I saw Julian coming up, and I didn't see. I think that Rudra had a question in the past. I'm not sure if it's a new one.
I still have a question.
Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just ask the questions, and then the panel
has a question.
Address.
Nino has a question.
So whoever has the hand up, please go ahead. First, Rudra, then Julian, and let me see if I can figure this out. Whoever else is.
Yeah, thank you.
Nino.
Don't wait for me.
Nino.
Can I come in? Am I first? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and profound thanks to all the panelists, especially Vanessa and Mohammed. We learned a lot, and when we joined the sympathy with you and hope to be able to do something at least from the Bangkok and in Thailand and Southeast Asia. I have two small questions. One is that there are 2 types of sanctions. Sanction against a particular government or regime. And second is a sanction against the country and the people as a whole. On the second one, I think we should work together in order to charge the crimes against humanity, war crime and so on, against governments and leaders that have been imposing sanctions against a particular country and the population of that particular country. Okay, separate the sanction against the government or the regime from the sanction against the people. I think we could work together on this one. We can go to the UN General Assembly. We can go to the International Criminal Court. We can organize series of international conferences and so on to rally the awareness and I think the joint undertaking and so on. We have to end this, I think, comprehensive across the board sanction that do hurt ordinary people, especially from the, I think, deprivation of healthcare and food. The second one is that just a question, I think, to Vanessa in particular on Mohammed. What happened to the Geneva Conference on Syria? Is that forgotten? There will be no, I think, peaceful negotiation to solve the problem, or is it going to be settled by Russian arms and Turkish intervention and Iranian and US and so on? What happened to the negotiation for all the parties concerned in Syria? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kasit. And now Julian, and then Nino, and then Rudra. Please go ahead.
Thank you, panelists. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much to the distinguished panel. It's a very painful topic. My question is about, responses. And as I mentioned in the chat, the counter sanctions or reverse sanctions. And this has been talked about. I mean, I know that China has been working on the renminbi as an alternative currency. And of course, the West is poo-pooing this all the way through and saying it's just not practical and everything else. But how do we begin, in some sense, to describe and to implement and to plan for what Samir Amin, the political economist, called delinking? In other words, moving away increasingly from capital, from this hegemonic system, which uses finance, which uses the military imperialist power and everything else, and all of the inhumanity, I mean, the genocide really with sanctions and war against the peoples of the world. I mean, the United States has a military presence in 172 countries, 1,000 military bases. We all know that, the statistics. And so how do we begin to isolate from the other side? Almost a boycott, which is a revolutionary strategy to talk about what Fidel talked about, which is the establishment of a humane, a new, radically different international economic order, that is rooted with the people, that serves, unlike the United Nations and UNESCO and all these World Health Organization, which are tools of Western imperialism. So what about these alternatives? I'd like to hear from the panel. Thank you very much, panelists, for your presentations, contributions.
Thank you, Julian. Let's add to the list Nino's question, please. Nino?
Yes, I'm unmuting.
You're muted, Nino.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. I'm totally happy to hear so many panelists, whom some of them I follow closely, for their valuable information. And this is a very important topic, the sanctions and the violence that sanctions create. I totally agree with the reframing of concepts as it was suggested. Like, we speak of regime change, but actually the regimes that need to be changed are the Western regimes, as it was mentioned. These are the capitalist, imperialist, and colonialist regimes that need changing. The emphasis also is important to make, and I think it has been mentioned, that these governments that are being sanctioned, these are governments that have been democratically elected by the majority of people. Vanessa just pointed to the latest one. So I think that's sort of an interesting background. Now, my specific point is to the fact of, or to the mention of bypassing sanctions. And I think that's extremely difficult for each individual country to bypass sanctions. In fact, it can be even dangerous, as we know in the case of those who attempt to do that, like Alex Sabes from Venezuela has been mentioned, has been punished for trying to feed and bring supplies to Venezuela. So the bypassing sanctions cannot be handled under the current global financial system that is controlled by the US and the US dollar. Now, my question is, and I raised this sometime before, but I think it needs more analysis, and that is the fact of the possibility of the sanctioned government or countries coming together in a world association, global association. There are about 39 countries, to my count, that are sanctioned actually by the US and allies. So now these 39 countries could conceivably come together, put aside all other kind of differences they might have, and come together and form an association. That would be a strong financial association as well, allowing trade and so on and so forth. I believe Russia and China are leading that kind of multilateral group of nations, replacing the hegemonic control of the US. So the question specifically, what are the chances, the possibility of we activists, journalists, and so on, promoting this idea of a global association of sanctioned countries to actually stop the impact and the negative impact and the criminality of sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And let's add Rudra's question, and then the panelists will have a lot of work. So whoever wants to stay, we stay on.
Thank you very much. It is rather becoming more and more interesting and enriching. My question is like this. It's not exactly a question, but an intervention. That we are going through a serious pandemic at the global level. I think whole world is sensitive about it. But the local level, when we see, there have been a number of cases where people have been hospitalized, and there is a crisis call comes from the relations and all that, saying that so much of money is needed to pay for the hospital so that the life can be saved. And a huge amount of crowdfunding also comes in. In matters of hours, $100,000 and those kind of amounts are being generated so that the hospital bills can be paid and one life can be saved. And at the end of it, the government, the hospital, and everybody feels happy that, okay, so much money got generated and hospital saved the life. But the moot question in such kind of situations is that, can the hospital bill be so inflated, so much high, that maybe a professor, I have been working for the last 30 years, I cannot pay for my survival in a single hospitalization case. The hospitals have collaborated to be profit institutions, and correspondingly, it is working like a profit institution corporate. And the larger question, if I take it further, I would connect it to Richard Baldwin's, what he called it as the Great Convergence framework. That is the corporates and the role of capital that is guiding the countries and the leadership and the direction of actions, sanctions, and foreign assistance and foreign aid is moving in the direction and the interest and the roadmap of the corporates. So it is, I think, more of a role of the capital and its orientation towards being profit-seeking. That is, I think, guiding the geopolitical framework as well as the local, regional political space. So the basic question here is, I think capital and the profiteering processes that is becoming more and more acute, which is, I think, creating conditions of very incompatible conditions for social growth and cohesive processes. I think the question is somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudra. We'll go around the panel in the order of the presentation. I like to suggest that. So maybe let me start with Sarah. You've been kind of quiet for a bit. Sarah, then Sira, then John, then Vanessa, then Mohammed, and then we'll close. What would people want to elaborate on these points? Please go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, I think that I'll try
closing notes too. Any closing notes that you have?
Sure. Just in response to this question of the decentralization of the US dollar, the US regime's vision and the US in general is brilliant. And I think it goes with the greater point that I want to reinforce that was said so well by Vanessa of we have to make them irrelevant. That is absolutely rings true for me, both on very intimate levels and also on a macro global scale. In Cuba, in terms of this decentralization of the dollar, a lot of things have happened recently. And just in these weeks and ending at the end of this month, there's actually a new de-dollarization happening. Where the US dollar is no longer able to be put into the banks. And so that's actually this also goes with the question of how effective are the sanctions in creating opposition to the government. It's very linked because it's everything is very paradoxical and double-sided, where that feels very frustrating at a time when the value of the US dollar has just been really potent on the streets. Like within the time of COVID, and through what the Trump administration did, the dollar on the street used to be worth less than what the Cuban kook was worth. So the kook was the dollar currency that Cuba had created as a way to interact with the foreign market that now no longer exists. about, something like 6 months ago, it was ended. And now this month, right now in June, they're ending the presence of the US dollar, which feels like a hit, because if you had a dollar in your hand, it was worth so much on the street. But the truth is that the government can't use those dollars anywhere. So it's now suddenly, in a time of desperation, of needing foreign currency, particularly the US dollar, is literally not worth anything. So people have 1 month to be able to turn in their US dollars and get it changed back. And then thereafter, the invitation and the arms wide open remains to currencies of any other kind. If they're able to make their way into the country or folks' bank accounts, then yes, please. So this both breeds a sense of frustration and heightened desperation, but it also is part of reasserting the sovereignty of the Cuban economy at the same time. And I guess that there's too much to talk about. So I'll just go on to this question about how the sanctions are effectively getting ordinary people to oppose the government. In that tangle of changes and frustrations, and inside the psychological pain of the sanctions that has been endured for decades now, the brewing of that frustration and the reality of having every day be oriented around how to get enough food to eat for tomorrow, it does take a deep kind of gnawing effect on the people. And yet folks are also solid. So simultaneously that it feels more immediate, and there's jokes in Cuba about how we blame everything on the blockade. So why am I just like comiendo pan con mayonesa? Like, why am I still eating just bread and mayonnaise is like our best food that we can find for today? And people will say, well, it's the blockade. And there's a double joke in that, because Cubans are sick of having it feel like an excuse. And simultaneously, the blockade has only gotten worse. And they also know that to be very true. Also, family separation, the incentivization of leaving Cuba with a kind of a refugee story to land in the United States. The United States will receive people like with kind of extra facilitation because they're Cubans, but enmeshed in that is that the Cuban people then need to portray this story of having to run from their homeland. And what's ironic is that even Cubans who consider themselves opponents of the government are vehemently proud of their culture and of the healthcare being free and of the education being free. So there's actually quite a lot of real truth story. And I guess that'll bring me to my final point about how we can move this information to a wider audience. Is I think that just returning to some of the laws of grassroots mobilization, the natural law of human communication, that simplifying the stories using language that is language of the people, connecting struggles in other countries with struggles that Cuban people face, and having, unlike me today, because I'm speaking on Cuba from experience, but I'm not a Cuban person, having the Cuban people themselves as experts of their own experience and experts in their fields, because they're such high level knowledge holders in their different regions of expertise, be the ones who speak through video conferencing, through the recording and sharing of those documentaries, but also through direct invitation to travel, because Cuba is interested in sending its folks internationally. And then again, at the end of the day, I just want to reiterate this notion of making the oppressor irrelevant by way of our solidarity. And as with all social justice work, that so much of these projects that would really help the people on the ground is by way of direct relationship. So forming personal bonds and staying in those relationships, developing authentic trust. It's not about a one-off interaction, but it's about finding the ways to make it work. And it takes patience and perseverance and commitment to relationship on a human level. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. Maybe Sarah, if you'd like to send a message to us. No, the connection is poor. So I will see that, but we'll look forward to receiving, we look forward to receiving maybe something from you that we can either post on our website and circulate, etc. So John, would you like to add or elaborate on the points and the questions?
Yes, I just wanted to come back to, I think, the question from Radhika. really the sanctions have not been very effective in changing opinion in Nicaragua. And that's because the US adopted a completely stupid approach. In 2018, it provoked violence and saying it thought that violent regime change efforts would be effective. And this had a very negative effect on Nicaraguan public opinion from the US perspective, because of course, all Nicaraguans remember what happened in the 1980s when the US sponsored the Contra attacks against the Sandinista government at that time. So the US was ignorant of its own past experience in failing to disrupt Nicaraguan society, or I suppose it was successful in the 1980s because the Sandinistas lost the election in 1990, but it failed to remember that Nicaraguans too have memory and will reject US-sponsored violence. But the middle classes in Nicaragua and those who aspire to be in the elite, many of them have always opposed the Sandinista government. And of course, they continue to oppose the Sandinista government. What happens then is that the sanctions have had a powerful effect, I think, or the US intervention has had a powerful effect on the attitudes of the left in the US, in Canada, and in Europe towards the Sandinista government. And why is that the case? That they're getting their information from supposedly progressive media like The Guardian, New York Times, and so on. But they're also getting fed information from the Nicaraguan middle classes who are now aligned with the Nicaraguan opposition. And I think one of the tasks that we have through media like today is to break into progressive opinion in the West and say, look, this is ridiculous. You know, you don't have to support the US measures against any of the governments that we're talking about. All of the governments that we support have got their faults, whether it's in Nicaragua, Cuba, Syria, Venezuela, or Iran. But they're all trying to struggle against US intervention. And ordinary people in these countries are very strongly opposed to US intervention. And it's the duty of the left in Western countries to support ordinary people in these countries, not the elites who are sometimes allied with the US in opposing those governments. And I think that's a very strong message we want to get across, perhaps through your manifesto group.
Thank you, John, very much. It gives us something to do. We have a lot of work to do here. Vanessa and finally Mohammed, if you guys would like to, add a closing or address, some of the points or a closing thought for us.
Yeah, I would really like to address the idea that there are two different levels of sanctions, one against individuals and one against a whole country. In reality, there is not this kind of division. If we look at Yemen, if we take the UN resolution 2216, which was brought in after Saudi Arabia started its genocidal war of aggression against the Yemeni people. Now, resolution 2216 involved the sanctioning or the embargo against 5 named individuals, right? And we're still working within the 2216 area, let's say, which is based on the legitimacy of the resigned President Mansour Hadi, who had fled at that point Yemen and had gone to Riyadh and demanded that Saudi Arabia started to bomb his own country. So those 5 named individuals, those sanctions were exploited by the Saudi coalition, which of course we know is controlled by the UK, France, the US, etc., to impose a blockade on 23 million Yemenis. So while we may be being told that no, but these sanctions are only against these named individuals, they are then exploited by the aggressor to increase the blockade on the entire people. The same in Syria. The original sanctions were against named individuals, but of course they've been increased and increased and increased as Syria has resisted the military regime change war. So I think we have to be very careful of saying we can oppose these sanctions, but not these sanctions. I think we really have to be very definite and say sanctions should not be used under any circumstances, because they are always weaponized. They are always used to literally kill the people of a target nation, because they're in the hands of literally a psychopathic, unipolar entity which is determined to hang on to its imperialist power. So it's not in the hands of a rational power. And we have to remember that. So even as we, as decent human beings, think, yeah, well, if it's against named individual, that means it's not going to affect the whole nation. Wrong. It will always affect the whole nation. It will be exploited to affect the whole nation.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa. The research I do on the health effects of sanctions completely confirms that. There is no such a thing as, in practice, targeted sanctions. So let us, it just doesn't work like that. Even if we give them the benefit of the doubt and take them at face value. So let's move on to Mohammed, just to close.
Yes, the sanctions are sort of like the precision guided missiles that we always hear about. And when they were used in Libya, supposedly all they targeted were military installations. Of course, those military installations are full of young men who have families. It's a sovereign country, but that aside, after the war was over, we saw that the United States and NATO destroyed the country's infrastructure. They destroyed all of the facilities needed for people to sustain themselves, and all that was intentional. And the same is true with Yemen, the same is true with Syria, and the same is true with other countries that are being targeted by sanctions. The United States and its allies are determined to crush these societies to get their way. That's basically it. There's no ambiguity around it. I was in Aleppo when East Aleppo was liberated from the extremists. Afterwards, I was invited to and I was also in in northern Iraq when Mosul was liberated from ISIS. On both occasions, I was there right after I went to those liberated areas right after they were taken. And soon afterwards, I was invited by the South Korean Foreign Ministry for a conference. And at that conference, a lady officer, a US officer, was saying how monstrous it was that East Aleppo was devastated. And I asked her after she spoke, have you ever been to Syria? She said, yes. I said, so you've been to Raqqa, the city that you bombed and destroyed? And she went silent. And then I also said to her that in the north of Iraq, the city, when the Iranian-led forces on the ground were liberating Mosul from ISIS, your airplanes were bombing in some areas. They were bombing the Iranian-led forces, but in some cases they were bombing ISIS, or they were supposedly bombing ISIS. They destroyed the university of Mosul. They destroyed all of the key installations in the city that people need to survive. Much of the city was completely destroyed. So when the Americans and the Europeans and NATO countries speak about targeting individuals, it's just like when they speak about smart bombs and precision guided weapons and that sort of nonsense. The target is to destroy, and the target is to create as much chaos and misery as possible in order to get their way. As I said earlier, the only difference between what happened in Gaza and Syria is that in Syria it's a silent death. In fact, I've been to Syria 11 or 12 times in the past decade, since the dirty war began. The economic situation today in Syria is worse than during the civil war, the dirty war. It's worse than when half of Damascus was taken by ISIS. It's worse than when half of the north of Syria was in the hands of Al-Qaeda. It's worse than that. Why? Because back then, there were battlegrounds, certain cities were being destroyed, young men were being murdered. Some people, ordinary people, were being killed by shells, but the rest of society, the rest of the country was functioning. People did business, people went to work. Now, the Americans and the Europeans are determined to shut down the country. Just 5-6 weeks ago, there was no gasoline in Syria. People couldn't move around town. People could not use their cars. Imagine living in Canada and there's no gasoline. What does that mean? That means people die. That means people lose their jobs. That means the misery is just, it cannot be calculated. But no one will talk about it because there's no sound, there's no explosion, there's no high-rise tower coming down as in Gaza. So the crimes being committed against humanity by the United States and its allies through sanctions are just as evil and just as destructive as what we saw the apartheid regime do in Gaza.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Radhika has something to read from Syria.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. So I would just like to read a statement from Syria because her connection is not good. So let me see. Okay. As you know, Venezuelans have difficulty getting the medications we need. The communes are not only a space for resistance, but also the epicenter in the construction of a new socialist society. In fact, they are that which Chavez proposed is happening. Sorry, it's a slightly miswritten. With that in mind, we are working with an extraordinary commune, Comuna El Panal, to get medications for its self-organized health center. And I've sent you a link here. Please read it. It's in Spanish, but it's straightforward. So I'm going to paste that link again and also the whole message. There you go. So please look at that link. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika, very much. So unfortunately, very sadly, we have to close, but there are some good messages of hope. One is that this is only the first panel on sanctions. We will continue working on this extremely important topic, addressing a variety of perspectives, all of which are linked and very significant. But I picked up 3 messages of hope, more or less, and they're compatible with my own research on the topic of sanctions of a little over a year. And both from the panelists and from comments in the audience that we can only fight hegemonic narratives with very strong, increasing, and widespread counter-hegemonic ones. So they're very powerful, but we are more. So we just have to counter that. That's one line of attack. And I mean attack in a very literal sense, because we have to go for the offense. We just can't simply defend ourselves all the time. The second one that I'm picking up is that countries who are being sanctioned, are cooperating. And that cooperation frightens the sanctioning countries, the sanctioning regimes. And they frighten it, not only we can see that, but they actually, when they talk to one another, they talk like that. They're concerned about these cooperation initiatives, right? They're afraid of them. And the third, finally, is that we have some strong guys with us around, and John, Ross mentioned China, and that's the only one. I said, well, a little bit maybe, Russia too, but China is certainly very, very strong, and we can only hope that they will join in and use the weapon of sanctions to give the sanctioning regimes a taste of their own medicine. They don't like that. A case in point is the pushback against the BDS movement in Palestine, and we have a couple of panels coming up addressing these points, but we have some hope. The situation is terrible. It's very appalling, and seeing so much suffering is very, very painful. But we have some strategies to fight back. So I try to put those together, and I think that we can all contribute within our own networks and possibilities to doing those things. And without further ado, let's close the panel for today.